in the autumn of 1860, within a western county of Missouri, still labeled Blackwater on old maps. 9 households disappeared over the course of a single harvest season. Not 9 individuals, but 9 complete families, men, women, children, grandparents, hired hands, even the dogs that had slept beneath the porches. By the time the first killing frost arrived in November, 9 farmsteads stood abandoned to the wind, with half-eaten meals still on the tables, cradles swaying gently in the draft, and Bibles lying open to the very pages their owners had been reading when whatever occurred took place. The county clerk who originally assembled the list was himself dead before Christmas. The ledger he maintained remained sealed inside a locked cabinet at the Jefferson City State House for more than 6 decades. When a historian finally forced it open in the 1920s, he discovered a single sheet of paper pinned to the inside cover, inscribed in a trembling hand. Upon that sheet were 4 words that have never received a satisfactory explanation. Before we proceed further into the story of Blackwater County, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments which state or city you are joining us from tonight, because what follows is the sort of history deliberately buried, and those who interred it relied upon everyone forgetting. The 4 words on that pinned page were these: they took them willing. To grasp why a county clerk in western Missouri would pen those words in a quivering hand before consuming laudanum in a Sedalia boarding house and succumbing to what the coroner euphemistically termed nervous exhaustion, you must first understand what Blackwater County represented in the summer of 1863, and what it had already become by the time the final family vanished. You must comprehend a distinct variety of American darkness that wears no uniform, flies under no banner, yet thrives in the gaps between banners, when the customary bonds between neighbors have been dissolved by the greater cruelty of the world. You must understand, in essence, what civil war does to the land and its people when the armies remain distant, and the only soldiers you encounter are those who arrive at your door after midnight. Blackwater County lay along the lower stretches of the Blackwater River, a slow, brown waterway that emptied into the Lamine and eventually into the Missouri. The land was fertile, not the rich black bottomland of the lower Mississippi, but rolling prairie interspersed with timber, limestone outcroppings, clear springs, and enough level ground between the hills to cultivate proper crops of hemp, tobacco, and winter wheat. Families had been establishing themselves there since the 1830s, most arriving from Kentucky and Tennessee via flatboat and wagon, bringing with them the accents and fierce Scotch, Irish pride of the Upper South. They carried their ballots and their feuds, their cornbread recipes and their whiskey formulas, their wariness of outsiders, and their intense devotion to kin. They possessed a ruggedness forged by 3 generations of clearing timber and breaking sod, and beneath that hardness lived a tenderness that surfaced at barn raisings, weddings, and funerals, and that tenderness would ultimately be weaponized against them. By 1860, the census recorded slightly over 4,000 souls in the county, spread across some 600 farms, with 2 small towns at the crossroads and a 3rd settlement down by the river landing, where steamboats had once docked before the war. The landing settlement was named Marlowe's Ferry, after the man who had first piloted a flatboat across the river in 1834. It housed grain warehouses, a blacksmith shop, a general store, and 3 saloons, and conducted a lively trade in pork, tobacco, hemp, and the rougher commerce that invariably clusters around a river port. Upstream, at the intersection of the Old State Road and the Military Road, stood the county seat, a town called New Salisbury, featuring a red brick courthouse erected in 1851, a jail of hewn stone, a bank, 2 churches, and a row of clapboard storefronts facing the square. Every resident of the county visited New Salisbury at least twice annually, once to settle taxes and once to attend the fall circuit court. And everyone in the county recognized everyone else by sight, if not by name. The families who resided there were not wealthy. A few held enslaved individuals, typically 1 or 2 house servants, and perhaps a field hand. But the majority were modest farmers who worked their own land with their own hands and their own sons. They attended church on Sundays at one of 4 small white frame meeting houses. They interred their dead in family plots on the back 40. And they relied upon their neighbors out of necessity. The nearest physician was 11 miles away in fair weather and 3 days distant in poor conditions. If a child developed a fever at midnight, you did not wait for the county doctor. You rode to the nearest farmhouse and knocked. And the man who answered, regardless of his politics, his fatigue, or any grievance that might have existed between your families, would take his coat from its peg and ride back with you through the darkness. That trust, that intricate web of small loyalties between neighbors, was the first casualty of the war. Missouri in 1863 was not a battlefield in the manner of Virginia. No grand armies marched across it in blue and gray formations. There were no Gettysburgs, no Antietems, no expansive fields of corpses arranged in rows for photographers to capture. What existed instead was something older, more intimate, and infinitely more dreadful. A war of neighbor against neighbor. Of the boy who had kissed your daughter the previous spring, now riding up your lane with a pistol and a score to settle. Of the man who had assisted in raising your barn in '59, now informing on your husband to the Home Guard. The state had officially declared for the Union. But in the western counties, where the Missouri River curved southward and the land stretched toward Kansas, loyalties fractured down the middle of every family and every congregation. Brothers fought on opposing sides. Fathers disowned sons. Wives condemned husbands from the pulpit. Elderly men who had voted Whig, Democrat, and know nothing throughout their long lives, now cast their ballots with rifles, and not always for the side their neighbors anticipated. Into that fractured country rode the bushwhackers. They styled themselves partisan rangers, guerrillas, or simply the boys. The Union labeled them murderers. They traveled in small bands of 10 or 20, armed with revolvers and shotguns, moving through the timber and river bottoms like phantoms. They burned out Union sympathizers, ambushed federal patrols, and subsisted off the farms of civilians, demanding meals, fodder, and horses, and woe to the family that refused. On the opposing side, the Home Guard and the enrolled Missouri militia, frequently manned by men with private vendettas, rode the same lanes in blue coats and performed largely identical work, though with the state's authority behind them. A Blackwater County farmer in the summer of '63 might be robbed at breakfast by one armed faction and again at supper by another, with neither band feeling obliged to leave him breathing when they departed. In a war where everyone bore some guilt, eliminating a witness was merely a matter of housekeeping. The most notorious of the bushwhackers, a lean-faced schoolteacher named William Clark Quantrill, had descended upon the Kansas town of Lawrence on the morning of August 21st, 1863, with 40-50 men at his back. By sunset that same day, 150 unarmed civilians lay dead in the streets, and the entire town center was ablaze. Every household in Blackwater County had heard the tale of Lawrence by the first week of September. And every household grasped its significance. The rules, whatever rules had ever existed, were finished. If a man with 400 horsemen could ride into a town of 2,000 and slaughter men and boys in their nightshirts, while their wives looked on, then nothing remained safe anywhere. No door was substantial enough, and no neighbor could be relied upon. The federal response to Lawrence arrived 4 days later, on August 25th, in the form of a single document signed by Brigadier General Thomas Ewing Jinger, commanding the District of the Border. It was designated General Order No. 11. It directed every person residing in the 4 western Missouri counties of Jackson, Cass, Bates, and the northern half of Vernon, with the exception of a narrow strip along the military roads, to abandon their homes within 15 days. They could carry what they could manage. Everything else, the order stipulated, would be confiscated or incinerated. The objective, Ewing wrote, was to deprive the bushwhackers of their civilian support base by evacuating the civilian population entirely. Families who had occupied those counties for 40 years were given 2 weeks to become refugees. 20,000 people were driven onto the roads before the first frost, and the territory they left behind became known for a generation as the Burnt District. What Ewing did not commit to paper, but what every officer under his command understood, was that the 4 named counties were not the only ones where the order would be enforced in practice. Any county within a day's ride of the Kansas line, and any county where guerrilla activity had been reported, could be subjected to the same treatment at the discretion of local commanders. Blackwater County did not appear on the official list, but by mid-September 1863, Blackwater County hosted a small federal garrison stationed at the county seat. That garrison was commanded by a captain from Illinois named Josiah Pickering, and Captain Pickering had been entrusted with a considerable degree of latitude indeed. This is the setting, and this is the moment in which 9 families vanished. The first to disappear was the Hollister family. Ephraim Hollister was 51, a widower with 4 grown children still residing at home, and 2 grandchildren in a back bedroom. His wife Martha had perished from milk sickness in 1858. He had raised the younger children alone, with the assistance of his eldest daughter Rebecca, who had been 23 that summer and already had 2 small children of her own after her husband fell at Wilson 661. Ephraim owned 160 acres on the eastern branch of the Blackwater River, a sturdy cabin with a stone chimney, a spring house, a smokehouse, a tobacco barn, and a team of Belgian draft horses purchased at a Boonville sale the previous spring. He was known throughout the county as a quiet man, an honest dealer, a Baptist of the stricter persuasion who abstained from spirits and profanity, and a dependable neighbor who had never in his life turned anyone from his door. On the morning of September 14, 1863, a man named Asa Crenshaw rode over to the Hollister place to borrow a whetstone for his scythe. Crenshaw was 63, a Methodist lay preacher with a pronounced limp from a youthful horse accident, and he lived about a mile and a quarter away across the timber. He had known Ephraim Hollister for 22 years. They had assisted one another at every harvest since before the war commenced. They had buried each other's wives. They had shared the last good jug of peach brandy in the county on the 4th of July in '62. Sitting on the Hollister porch with their feet up, debating the war, until the moon sank behind the trees. When Asa Crenshaw entered the Hollister yard that morning, the dogs were absent. That was his first observation. The Hollisters kept 3 hounds, and a yellow mongrel that slept on the porch, and none emerged to greet him. The second thing Crenshaw noticed was that the chickens remained in the yard, scratching at the packed earth, and no one had thrown them corn. Ephraim Hollister fed the chickens every morning before breakfast. It was a routine you could set your watch by. The third thing Crenshaw observed as he drew nearer was that the cabin's front door stood half open, and a gingham apron was caught on the latch, flapping gently in the morning breeze. Crenshaw called out from the yard. Receiving no response, He tied his mule to the hitching post, mounted the porch, and paused with his hand on the doorframe, listening. The silence emanating from the cabin was the wrong kind of silence. The kind that possesses shape, that a man who has spent his entire life in the countryside recognizes as instinctively as the approach of a storm. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The table was set for breakfast for 7. Cornbread sat in the skillet on the hearth, now cold, with a knife beside it. A pitcher of buttermilk stood on the table, curdled and separating in the warm morning air, a fly traversing its rim. 7 plates, 7 tin cups, 7 places set with knives and spoons. Not one had been touched. A half-peeled apple lay on a cutting board at the table's end, the peel still attached in one continuous spiral, as if the hand holding the knife had simply set it down and walked away. The back bedroom where Ephraim's daughter Rebecca slept with her 2 children was empty. The bed was unmade, the quilt pulled back, as though she had risen in response to a call. A child's ragdoll rested on the floor, missing one button eye. The loft where the 3 sons slept was likewise empty. A clean shirt lay folded on the bed, as if someone had been about to done it. Outside in the yard, the draft horses remained in the barn, and the wagon still sat beneath the lean-to. Nothing had been removed. Nothing had been damaged. There was no blood, no evidence of struggle, no tracks of wagon wheels departing the property beyond those that had been there for weeks. The sole anomaly Crenshaw would later recall was that the Hollister family Bible, which always resided on a small shelf above the hearth, had been taken down and laid open on the table face up beside the cornbread skillet. The page it was open to was the 37th Psalm. Fret not thyself because of evildoers, for they shall soon be cut down like the grass and wither as the green herb. Asa Crenshaw rode to the county seat that same afternoon and reported the Hollisters missing to the sheriff. The sheriff was a weary man named Reuben Vaughn, who had been struggling to hold the county together with his bare hands since the war began. He rode out to the Hollister farm the following morning with 2 deputies and discovered precisely what Crenshaw had described. He composed a brief report, filed it with the county clerk, gazed at the open Bible for a long while, then closed it gently, returned it to its shelf, and walked out of the cabin. Standing on the porch in the cool September air, he experienced for the first time in his 11 years as sheriff a fear entirely unconnected to bullets or blades. It was a fear of the absence of sound, a fear of 7 untouched place settings. And then, because a war was underway and because men and women disappeared in Missouri every week in 1863 for 100 different reasons, he did what any sheriff would have done. He placed the Hollister case at the back of a drawer and waited to see if anyone returned. No one did. 6 days later, on September 20th, the Tillman family was gone. 8 people that time, including a grandmother of 74 who had been bedridden for 3 years with crippling arthritis, crying out in pain every time she was moved. The Tillman cabin was discovered in precisely the same condition as the Hollister cabins, a meal laid out. This time a supper of beans, ham, and cornbread gone cold in the pot, beds unmade, clothes in the press, livestock in the yard, hungry but alive. No blood, no tracks, no sign. And the elderly grandmother, Eliza Tillman, who had not walked under her own power since the winter of '60, was gone from her bed, with the covers turned back and her wooden cane still leaning against the wall. Whoever had taken her had carried her out, and done so with such gentleness that her little glass of laudanum on the bedside table had not even been spilled. 4 days after that, on September 24th, the Lamb family vanished. 9 people that time. The Lamb girl, Sarah, had been betrothed to a boy from the neighboring county, and her wedding dress was discovered laid out on her bed. Finished, pinned, ready for the final fitting. A small bouquet of pressed flowers gathered for the ceremony, tied with a blue ribbon, rested on the pillow beside the dress. The young man she was to marry, a farmer named Caleb Renfro from across the river, rode over upon hearing the news and sat on the edge of her bed for 2 hours without moving. When he finally rode home, he did not speak for 3 days. When he did speak, he declared that Sarah would never have left that dress behind. Not for the devil himself, not for anything on earth. She had labored over it for 7 months. If she had walked out of that cabin, leaving that dress folded on the bed, then she had not walked out. Someone had walked her out. And that, Caleb Renfro said, was what he could not live with. 3 weeks later, Caleb Renfro was found hanged in his father's barn. The coroner ruled it suicide. His father, who had taken the body down at dawn, never fully agreed. By the 1st of October, Sheriff Vaughn had 3 empty houses on his desk and a growing conviction that whatever was occurring was not the work of ordinary bushwhackers. Bushwhackers took horses, food, and revenge. They did not take entire families and leave the horses behind. They did not take grandmothers who could not walk, and they certainly did not take people so quietly that no one within 3 miles heard a single gunshot or scream. The lamb farm lay within 800 yards of the Crenshaw place. Asa Crenshaw had been awake that entire night, tending a sick calf in the barn, and had heard nothing. No hoofbeats, no voices, no barking dogs, nothing at all except, once around 2 in the morning, the faint squeak of a wagon axle passing along the river road, which he had assumed at the time was merely a neighbor driving home late from town. On October 3rd, Vaughn rode to the federal garrison at the county seat and requested assistance from Captain Josiah Pickering. Pickering was a lean man of 34, sharp, featured with a close, cropped beard, an Illinois accent, and a habit of cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a penknife while others spoke. He listened to Vaughn's account of the 3 missing families with an expression of professional concern. He posed a few quiet questions about the locations of the farms and whether any of the missing families had been known to harbor guerrilla sympathies. When Vaughn replied that to his knowledge they had not, Pickering nodded thoughtfully and jotted something in a small leather notebook. He then informed the sheriff that the disappearances were almost certainly the work of guerrillas crossing from the Lamine Bottoms, that the federal garrison lacked both the men and the orders to investigate civilian disappearances in an active war zone, and that Vaughn should go home and attend to the living. Reuben Vaughn departed Pickering's office that afternoon with a cold sensation he could not articulate. 20 years later, on his deathbed in a small house outside St. Louis, he would attempt to explain that feeling to his grandson, and would fail. The grandson would record it as best he could recall. It was, the old man said, the sensation of speaking to someone who already possessed the answers to every question you were asking, and who was politely awaiting your cessation of questioning. And it was the sensation of being appraised like livestock at market by eyes that had already determined your value. In the weeks that followed, as the Missouri sky shifted from hot September, blue to the flat pewter of October, and the first hard frosts descended from the north, 6 more families vanished from Blackwater County. The Corbins, 5 people. On October 11th, taken from a cabin near the head of Sugar Creek. The Osgoods, 7 people. On October 17th, taken from a fine 2-story clapboard house that had been the family's pride for 3 generations, with a library of 40 books in the front room and a rosewood piano Mrs. Osgood had played every evening. The McCaskills, a family of 11, counting 2 hired hands, on October 24th, taken from a large working farm with a dairy herd, still lowing in the barn the following morning. When a neighbor rode by, heard them, and stopped to investigate. A family named Grisham, 4 people, on November 1st. A family named Wagner, 6 people, on November 8th. And finally, on the night of November 15th, 1863, a family named Beaumont, 10 people, the largest household in the county, vanished from a cabin situated less than 2 miles from the federal garrison itself. 9 households, 67 people. Not one body, not one witness, not one shot fired. The community's reaction to this progression was not what later historians might anticipate. It was not outrage, nor was it panic. It was something colder and more familiar to anyone who has endured a long and relentless wartime. The slow contraction of the human spirit into itself. The drawing of curtains, the bolting of shutters, the silent understanding among neighbors not to ride out after dark, and not to ask too many questions of one another in daylight. By the first week of November, Blackwater County residents had ceased visiting one another for supper. By the second week, they had stopped waving from their wagons when they passed on the road. The churches emptied. The general store in New Salisbury reported that women were sending their husbands to purchase the weekly flour because they no longer wished to leave their farms. Not even for an hour. Not even on a Saturday morning. On the farms themselves, families slept in shifts, one man or boy awake at all times, a loaded shotgun across his knees, watching the road, the tree line, and the backfield by the light of a single candle burning low and slow through the long October nights. But the threat the families could not guard against, it turned out, was not the one they were watching for. They watched for bushwhackers. They watched for strangers, in their secret hearts. They watched for the galloping hoofbeats of Quantrill's men. Because every Missouri farmer, that autumn had seen Quantrill in his dreams at least once. What they did not watch for was a polite knock at the door around 10 o'clock at night, a familiar face on the porch holding a lantern, and a quiet voice speaking words that could almost be mistaken for kindness. Decades later, long after the war had concluded and the nation had moved on to other nightmares, the empty farms of Blackwater County passed into regional folklore. Travelers passing through the area in the 1870s and 80s reported seeing lamps lit in windows of houses that had stood abandoned for 20 years. A journalist from the Kansas City Star riding through on horseback in 1891 wrote a short piece about the phenomenon for the Sunday edition and dubbed the region the County of Empty Tables. Because that, he said, was what every one of the old homesteads contained: a zine, an empty table set for a meal nobody had lived to eat. School children growing up in New Salisbury in the early 20th century told one another stories about the Hollister cabin, still standing then in a corner of a cornfield, about the ghost of the little girl who had left her rag doll on the floor, about the sound of a spiral of apple peel unrolling in an empty room. But the folklore erred in one significant respect. The tables had not been empty when the families departed. The tables had been full, and whoever or whatever had taken those families had not acted in haste or fear. They had acted with a patience and thoroughness that suggested something far worse than a bushwhacker raid. Someone had come to those cabins. Someone had led those families out into the night, one by one, over the course of 2 months, and someone had ensured that no trace of their departure remained. If you are finding this story as unsettling as I am, take a moment now to hit the like button and leave a comment with your theory about what happened in Blackwater County. I read every comment, and your ideas shape the stories I tell next. Now, let us return to the beginning and examine what Sheriff Reuben Vaughn began to uncover when he finally ceased trusting the federal garrison and commenced his own investigation. The first thing Vari in Virginia noticed once he spread the deeds of the 9 missing families across the table in his small office at the county courthouse was that the farms were not random. He had initially assumed that the bushwhackers, or whoever was responsible, had simply taken whichever families were easiest to reach. But when he plotted the 9 farms on a county map using small black pins, borrowed from the tailor shop next door, the pattern that emerged was anything but random. The 9 farms formed a rough arc along the eastern bank of the Blackwater River, stretching some 11 miles from the northern county line down to the river landing in the south. They ranked among the best watered, best timbered, most productive parcels in the entire county. Taken together, they straddled the only natural corridor for any future railroad line that might be constructed from Boonville south toward the Ozarks. A corridor surveyed in 1859 by engineers from the Pacific Railroad and discussed in contemporary newspapers as a near certainty once the war ended and the national economy recovered. And they were all, without exception, adjacent to land that had been acquired within the preceding 18 months by a single purchaser. That purchaser was a St. Louis land company called Pickering and Lamb Associates. Vaughn stared at that name for a long time. Pickering, the same surname as the federal captain at the garrison, and Lamb, the same surname as the second missing family, whose patriarch, old Calvin Lamb, had been one of the most outspoken opponents of wartime land speculation in the county, and who had gone to his neighbors in the summer of 1863, warning them not to sell their deeds to any agent of any St. Louis company under any circumstances whatsoever. Old Calvin had been a fierce man, a veteran of the Black Hawk War, who carried his grievances written in a small notebook kept in the breast pocket of his coat. He had delivered speeches on the courthouse steps in June and July about how the war was being exploited by men in St. Louis, Chicago, and Philadelphia to strip Western farmers of everything they had built. He had named names. He had pounded his fist on the courthouse porch railing until it shook. Calvin Lamb had vanished with his entire family on September 24th. Vaughn rode to the county recorder's office the next morning and spent 6 hours working through the deed books. What he discovered was this: between the spring of 1862 and the autumn of 1863, Pickering and Lamb Associates had purchased 41 parcels of land in Blackwater County, all along the eastern bank of the Blackwater River, all within a mile of the 9 farms that had recently gone empty. The purchases had been made at remarkably low prices. In several cases, the deeds had been signed over by widows whose husbands had been killed by guerrillas earlier that same year and who needed cash quickly to feed their children through the coming winter. In other cases, the sellers were listed as having relocated to Illinois or Iowa, though no forwarding addresses were recorded, and no one in the county seemed to know exactly where they had gone. And in a few cases, most troublingly, the signatures on the deeds appeared, to Vaughan's careful eye, to have been written in a hand distinctly different from the hand on other county documents bearing the same names. Vaughn began very cautiously to ask questions. He rode out to the Wagner place, one of the missing farms, and searched the abandoned cabin with a thoroughness he had not employed on his first visit. He looked behind cupboards, lifted trunk lids, climbed into the loft, and pulled back the mattress ticking on each bed. Then, in a hollow beneath a loose floorboard under the bed in the main room, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a strip of cotton, he discovered a small packet of letters. The letters were addressed to Samuel Wagner, head of the missing family. They had been written over a period of 4 months, between June and October of 1863, and were signed by an agent of Pickering and Lamb Associates named Horace Osgood. Horace Osgood, the same surname as another missing family. Vaughn sat down on the edge of Wagner's bed and read the letters in order, from first to last, by the slanted afternoon light coming through the cabin's single window. The letters were, on their surface, polite business correspondence. The first, dated June 8th, introduced Mr. Osgood as a representative of a St. Louis firm interested in acquiring agricultural land in Blackwater County for post-war development and offered Samuel Wagner a fair market price for his 120 acres. The second letter, dated July 3rd, expressed polite disappointment at Mr. Wagner's refusal and raised the offer by 15%. The third letter, dated July 29th, raised the offer again and mentioned, in a casual aside, that several of Mr. Wagner's neighbors had recently accepted similar offers and relocated with their families to new lands in central Iowa that the company had arranged to purchase on their behalf. The fourth letter, dated August 20th, was different in tone. It mentioned by name the wife and children of Samuel Wagner, asked with apparent sympathy after the health of young Elias Wagner, who, Mr. Osgood had heard, was just beginning his first year at the county school, and observed in closing that the countryside had become a very dangerous place for young families in these troubled times, and that a man with children bore responsibilities a childless man could not fully understand. The fifth letter, dated September 10th, 6 days before the Hollister family vanished, spoke at length about the difficulty of protecting a rural family from the depredations of bushwhackers and home guard alike in such perils, and expressed the writer's genuine hope that Mr. Wagner would reconsider his position before events overtook the matter. And the sixth letter, dated October 4th, contained a single sentence that made Reuben Vaughn sit down on Wagner's dusty floor and put his face in his hands. The sentence read, "We have arrangements, Mr. Wagner, that can provide for the safety of your family in exchange for your cooperation, and we would be grieved to see you refuse a kindness that others in your position have been grateful to accept." Others in your position. Vaughn rode back to town with the letters in his saddlebag. That night, in the small room he rented above the dry goods store, he began to understand what had happened. Or, at least a version of what had happened, which would prove not to be the whole truth, though it was sufficient to get him killed. Some of the missing families, he reasoned, had been coerced. They had been told that bushwhackers or federal troops were coming for them, and they had been offered safe passage out of the county, likely in exchange for signing their deeds over to Pickering and Lamb Associates. They had departed in the night, walking or riding with an escort, and had been promised new land in Illinois or Iowa. Whether any of them had actually reached Illinois or Iowa was another matter entirely. But at least some of them, he believed, had walked out of their cabins willingly, believing they were being saved. And perhaps, he thought in the dim hours before dawn, perhaps some of them had indeed been sent on. Perhaps the first 2 or 3 families had actually boarded a wagon, actually ridden to a distant depot, actually reached Iowa, and actually been given new land. Because that was how a scheme of this kind would have to begin. You would have to send the first few families through the machine honestly, so that their letters back to the county would confirm the story, so that the next families would trust the offer. But somewhere along the way, the scheme had changed. Somewhere along the way, the men running it had realized that they did not need to pay for new land in Iowa if they could simply make the families disappear and forge the deeds. Somewhere along the way, the cost of moving 67 people to another state had exceeded the profit the land company was willing to accept. And the mathematics of the enterprise had been adjusted. That was the meaning of the 4 words that Vaughn would pin a month later to the inside cover of his ledger. They took them willing. The families had gone willingly. They had been led out by people they trusted, or by people they had reason to fear, and they had believed, at least in that first hour, that they were being rescued from something worse. The worst part was that the people who led them out had known from the beginning where the road actually ended. But Vaughn did not yet know what had happened to them after they left their cabins. He did not know whether they had been put on a train at some distant depot and sent to Iowa as promised, or whether they had been led to a quieter fate in the timber somewhere south of the river. He did not know which of his neighbors were part of the scheme, and which were merely its victims. He did not know who in the Pickering family was the mastermind and who was the errand boy. He did not know any of these things yet, and he was about to make the mistake of trying to find out. On the morning of November 22nd, 1863, 1 week after the disappearance of the Beaumont family, Sheriff Reuben Vaughn rode to the federal garrison and requested a formal meeting with Captain Josiah Pickering. He brought with him a canvas satchel containing the Wagner letters, a copy of the deed records from the county recorder, and a list of 41 parcels of land he believed had been acquired by fraud, coercion, or worse. He intended to confront Pickering directly with the evidence and to give him one chance, as a Union officer, to explain himself before Vaughn sent a copy of the evidence to the provost marshal in Jefferson City. Captain Pickering received him cordially. He offered him coffee. He listened without interruption for 45 minutes while Vaughn laid out the evidence on the captain's desk, speaking with the steady, methodical voice a lawman employs when building his case in public. He examined the deed records. He read the Wagner letters slowly, one by one, in the order they had been written. When he finished, he set the last letter down on the desk and looked up at Vaughn with a small, thoughtful expression on his thin face. "Sheriff," he said, "I believe you have done a remarkable piece of work here. And I am going to ask you to do one more thing before we proceed. I am going to ask you to wait here in this office for 1 hour while I send for a colleague of mine from the provost's office in Sedalia. He needs to hear this from you directly. Will you wait?" Reuben Vaughn, who had been a sheriff in Missouri for 11 years and who had seen men lie to him in 100 different ways, looked at Captain Josiah Pickering across the desk and did not see a single sign of deceit. He did not see a single sign of anything at all. Pickering's face was as smooth and as empty as a plate. Vaughn said he would wait. Pickering rose, put on his coat, and walked out of the office. What happened in the next 40 minutes is known only from a letter Vaughn wrote that same afternoon to his sister in St. Louis, which he mailed from a farmhouse 5 miles west of town after riding out of the garrison through a side gate at a flat gallop, with a federal bullet through the crown of his hat. In the letter, Vaughn described hearing through the closed door of Pickering's office the captain's voice speaking quietly to a sergeant in the outer room, giving instructions that included the words, "No trial, Rever," and "tonight." He described understanding in a single cold moment what those 3 words meant when combined, and what they had meant on 9 previous occasions over the preceding 2 months. He described climbing out of the office window, dropping into a narrow alley between garrison buildings, working his way through the stable yard crouched behind a water trough, while a stable hand whistled a tune 2 feet away and did not see him, stealing a cavalry horse whose reins he cut with his pocket knife, because he had no time to untee them, and riding south through the timber with 2 troopers in pursuit firing revolvers at his back. He described at the letter's end his conviction that he would not live much longer. He asked his sister to keep the letter. He asked her, if anything happened to him, to take the letter to a particular lawyer in St. Louis, whose name he wrote in the margin. And he closed the letter with a single sentence she would repeat in later years to anyone who asked about her brother's death. I have seen, he wrote, a face that belongs to the worst man I have ever met. And the worst thing about it is that it is the face of a man who believes himself to be an officer and a gentleman, and who has never for one moment doubted that he is. Just when you think the story could not possibly grow darker, the horror in Blackwater County intensifies. If this tale is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who appreciates dark American mysteries, or hit the like button to support the channel, and subscribe so you never miss another of these forgotten histories. Now, let us discover what Sheriff Reuben Vaughn uncovered in the final month of his life, and what he hid, and where he hid it, so that someone might eventually find it. Vaughn did not ride to Jefferson City. He understood by the time he crossed the Lamine River the next morning that if the conspiracy reached as high as a federal captain, it probably reached considerably higher, and that the provost marshal's office was as likely to hang him as to hear him. Instead, he rode north into the timber country along the Missouri River and vanished into a network of old friends, fellow Masons, and distant cousins stretching from Boonville to Glasgow. He spent the next 3 weeks living in barns and root cellars, moving every second night, never sleeping in the same place twice, in a small leather-bound notebook kept inside his shirt. He wrote every scrap of information he could remember, and every piece of evidence he had gathered, the names of the 41 parcels and the dates of each transaction, the text of the Wagner letters reconstructed from memory, the words he had heard through Pickering's door. Then, in the first week of December, he did something nobody has ever fully understood. He rode back to Blackwater County. He did not go to the county seat. He did not go home. He did not stop at his own house, where his wife still waited, uncertain whether he was alive or dead, uncertain whether to wear mourning or keep his supper warm. Instead, he rode in the middle of the night to the farm of Asa Crenshaw, the old Methodist lay preacher who had been the first to discover the empty Hollister cabin back in September. Crenshaw took him in, fed him, and listened to his story for 4 hours by the light of a single tallow candle. When Vaughn had finished, Crenshaw sat in silence for a long time, hands folded on the table, eyes fixed on the candle flame. Then he said something Vaughn wrote down in his notebook that same night. What Crenshaw said was this: I think I know where they are, Sheriff. I think I have known for some time, and I think that when I show you, you will understand why I have not spoken of it sooner. Where is it? And you will not, I think, find it in yourself to judge me too harshly, because I am an old man with a wife who cannot feed herself and 2 grandchildren in the back room. And the knowledge of what I am about to show you is the kind of knowledge that a man in this country, in this year of our Lord, cannot carry alone and live. The next morning, before dawn, the 2 men rode south along the Blackwater River to a place the old French voyagers had called the Bend, where the river made a sharp hook around a high limestone bluff, and the current cut a deep pool beneath the rock face. The pool was some 40 feet across and of uncertain depth. Local children had been warned away from it for as long as anyone could remember, because the current at the base of the bluff was treacherous, because the limestone above had a way of shedding slabs without warning, and because the older people said the pool did not give back what it took. 2 boys had drowned there in the 1840s, and one in the 1850s, and none of their bodies had ever been recovered. The river carried what it took. The saying went all the way down to the Gulf. Crenshaw dismounted at the edge of the bluff and led Vaughn to a narrow game trail descending to the water. The trail was barely wide enough for a single horse, winding down through scrub cedar and limestone shelves. Emerging after perhaps 4 minutes of careful walking onto a broad natural platform of pale rock some 12 feet above the pool. Halfway down, the trail passed a shelf of rock where the limestone had been recently disturbed. Fresh scratches showed where heavy stones had been rolled. The earth beneath the scratches was softer than the surrounding ground, as though it had been dug and refilled. Dug and refilled many times. Along the edge of the platform, where a person standing at the water's edge might pause before whatever came next. The rock face had been scored in a dozen places by what looked like the marks of boot nails and the drag of heavy heels. Crenshaw pointed to the shelf and said, "See it? I came down here in late September, Sheriff, because I was looking for a lost calf, and I saw 2 men standing where we are standing now, rolling a stone into the pool. I hid in the brush up above, where that cedar leans over the trail, and watched them. They were strong men, Sheriff, working in their shirt sleeves, and the stone they rolled was the size of a whiskey barrel. It went into the water with a sound I have not been able to get out of my dreams since. When they finished and had gone, I came down and looked at what was left on the ground. And what was left on the ground was a child's shoe. A girl's shoe, Sheriff. Brown leather with a small brass buckle. It was the shoe of Ephraim Hollister's granddaughter. I had seen her wear it at the camp meeting in August. I picked it up, took it home, and have it still hidden behind a loose board in my spring house, where my wife will not find it. I have not spoken of it in 3 months, because I have a wife and 2 grandchildren of my own, and I have a good Methodist knowledge of what this country has become. And I was afraid. God forgive me, Sheriff, I was afraid." Vaughn stood on the shelf and looked down at the dark water. He saw what had happened. He did not speak for a long time. The morning mist lay on the pool's surface in thin gray ribbons, and a single crow called from the bluff above them. The water was so still that Vaughn could see his own face in it, looking back up at him from a great depth. Then he asked Crenshaw how many times the old man thought the stones had been rolled. Crenshaw said he could not be sure, but the disturbance of the earth suggested many separate occasions spread over the weeks when the families had been disappearing. Perhaps 1 visit for each family, perhaps 2 for the larger ones. Vaughn asked whether Crenshaw had recognized the 2 men he had seen. Crenshaw said he had, and that this was the hardest part of what he had to tell. One of them, he said, was Horace Osgood, the land agent who had written the letters to Samuel Wagner. The other, he said, was a sergeant from the federal garrison at the county seat, a man named Luther Pickering, the captain's cousin. Vaughn took out his notebook and wrote the 2 names down. Then he and Crenshaw rode back to Crenshaw's farm in silence. That night in the preacher's barn, Vaughn copied every page of his notebook into a second ledger. A larger one Crenshaw had kept for his farm accounts and had never filled more than halfway. He worked by the light of a single lantern hung from a nail on a beam, writing for 6 hours. When he finished, he pinned to the inside cover a single sheet of paper on which he wrote in a hand already beginning to shake from what he knew. 4 words. They took them willing. He did not mean by those words that the families had gone willingly to their deaths. He meant that the families had gone willingly out of their cabins, believing they were being saved, and that this was the worst part of the entire matter, because it meant they had trusted the men who killed them, and the men who killed them had used that trust as the instrument of the killing. He meant that a betrayal of that depth was something for which American law, as he had practiced it for 11 years, had no adequate name. He gave the ledger to Asa Crenshaw and asked him to hide it somewhere no one would find it until the war was over and the country had come to its senses. Crenshaw wrapped the ledger in a double layer of oilcloth, tied it with hemp cord, and buried it beneath the packed earth floor of his root cellar. Down in a corner behind barrels of smoked pork, under a stone he had marked on its underside with a small cross in candle suit. In the morning, Reuben Vaughn rode east toward Jefferson City for the second time, intending now to reach the State House in person and place the original notebook and his own sworn testimony into the hands of the governor himself. He never arrived. On December 19, 1863, his body was found in a creek bed some 40 miles east of Blackwater County, with 2 pistol balls in the back of his head. The official report listed the cause of death as murder by persons unknown, probably bushwhackers. His horse was never recovered. His saddlebags were empty. The notebook he had been carrying was gone. His widow received a brief letter of condolence from the provost marshal's office, along with his watch, found in his vest pocket, and his wedding ring, which had been cut from his finger and returned to her in a paper envelope without explanation. The county clerk, a man named Elijah Redfern, who had helped Vaughn compile the original ledger of missing families in October, heard of the sheriff's death on the morning of December 22nd. He spent that afternoon in his office at the courthouse, going through the papers Vaughn had left in his desk drawer, and found enough there to understand in outline what his friend the sheriff had uncovered and what it had cost him. 2 days later, on Christmas Eve, Elijah Redfern took the coach to Sedalia. He rented a room at a boarding house on Ohio Avenue. There he wrote a summary of everything he knew in the margins of his personal copy of the county's missing persons register. He pinned a single sheet of paper to the inside cover, on which he copied the same 4 words Vaughn had given him. They took them willing. Then he walked to the apothecary on Main Street, purchased a bottle of laudanum, returned to his room, and drank the entire bottle before lying down on the bed with his hands folded over his chest. He was found by the boarding housekeeper the next morning, Christmas Day, 1863. The coroner ruled the death an accidental overdose from a medicine taken for nervous complaints, and the ledger in his possession was returned unexamined to the clerk's office in New Salisbury, where it was placed in a locked cabinet by the acting clerk and forgotten. The ledger, buried beneath Asa Crenshaw's root cellar, remained where Crenshaw had placed it. Crenshaw himself died of pneumonia in the winter of 1867, without ever telling anyone in his family what lay beneath the cellar floor. He had intended several times to tell his son. He had tried once on a Sunday afternoon in the spring of '66, and had lost his nerve halfway through a sentence, turning the conversation to the planting of corn. The farm was sold out of the family in 1872, after his son moved west to Kansas in search of cheaper land. The new owners tore down the old cabin and built a new one on a different part of the property, and the root cellar, now abandoned, slowly filled with dirt and rubble and was forgotten. In the spring of 1923, a young historian from the University of Missouri named Ellsworth Hadley, who had been working on a doctoral dissertation about the civilian cost of the Missouri guerrilla war, came to Blackwater County looking for primary sources. He spent 3 weeks interviewing elderly residents in their parlors and on their porches, patiently drawing out the stories their parents and grandparents had told them, and that they had never thought to write down. In the course of those interviews, He heard from the granddaughter of Asa Crenshaw a story her grandmother had whispered to her on her deathbed, about a sheriff who had come to the farm one night in the winter of '63 and left something important buried in the old root cellar before he rode east to die. The granddaughter had not known whether to believe the story. Her grandmother had been 91 years old and in and out of her senses in her final week. But she repeated it to the young historian because he seemed genuinely interested, and because he was a polite young man with a notebook and good manners, and she had no one else to tell. Hadley obtained permission from the current owner to dig. On the afternoon of April 11, 1923, in a drizzling spring rain that turned the earth to cold clay under his hands, he unearthed a rotted oilcloth packet. Inside the packet, remarkably preserved, was Reuben Vaughan's second ledger. Hadley spent 6 months transcribing and verifying its contents. He rowed out to the bend where the river still made its hook around the limestone bluff, and stood on the platform above the pool, looking down into the dark water. He cross-referenced the deed records. He tracked down what had become of Pickering and Lamb Associates. In the archives of the St. Louis Probate Court, he found the will of Horace Osgood, who had died a wealthy man in 1891. His estate at the time of his death, including controlling interests in 4 Missouri banks, a St. Louis hotel, and some 13,000 acres of land along the Blackwater and Lamine rivers, including every one of the 41 parcels acquired by the old land company during the war. He found that Captain Josiah Pickering, at war's end, had been promoted to major, resigned his commission honorably in 1866, returned to Illinois, become a state senator, and died in his bed in 1904, widely mourned by his constituents. He found that Luther Pickering, the sergeant, had been killed in a saloon brawl in Kansas City in 1871, and that at the time of his death he had been carrying a silver pocket watch engraved with the initials E.H., which Hadley believed, though he could not prove, had belonged to Ephraim Hollister. And he found, most painfully, that the railroad line surveyed in 1859 had in fact been built in the 1880s, running directly along the corridor defined by the 41 parcels of Blackwater County land. The sale of those parcels to the railroad company in 1883 had made the heirs of Horace Osgood and Josiah Pickering richer in a single transaction than any of the 9 families who had been killed for them could have imagined becoming in 20 lifetimes of honest work. Hadley submitted his findings, along with the ledger itself, to the Missouri Historical Society in the autumn of 1923. The Society's board of directors reviewed the material and, on a vote of 5-2, declined to publish. The minutes of that meeting, eventually declassified in the 1960s, indicate that the majority of the board believed the evidence was strong, but that the descendants of several families named in the ledger were prominent citizens of St. Louis and Chicago, and that publication would cause, in the words of the board chairman, a degree of distress disproportionate to the public interest at this remove of time. The ledger was placed in the Society's closed archives. Hadley's dissertation, under pressure from his department chair, was rewritten to focus on other, less controversial aspects of the Missouri War. Hadley himself, a deeply disappointed man who had spent his own money pursuing the investigation, took a teaching position at a small college in Indiana and never published on the subject again. He died in 1941, leaving behind a box of private papers his wife donated to his alma mater, where they sat unread in a basement storage room for another 40 years. The ledger was finally read by outside researchers in 1967. When the Missouri Historical Society opened its closed archives for the state's centennial of the Civil War, 2 articles were written. One appeared in a regional historical journal with a readership of perhaps 400 specialists. The other appeared in the Sunday supplement of a Kansas City newspaper and was read by a few thousand people for a few days, then forgotten. The descendants of the Pickering and Osgood families, by then scattered across 4 states and several generations, were never publicly named. No criminal investigation was ever opened because the statute of limitations on murder in Missouri, though technically unlimited, is functionally meaningless when every person involved has been dead for half a century and every piece of physical evidence lies under 40 feet of river water. This mystery reveals something American history has always been uncomfortable saying aloud, that in the chaos of a great war, some people do not become heroes and some do not become villains, but some, quietly in the shadow of real violence, use that violence as cover to do small and terrible things for money. And those small and virginal and terrible things can remain hidden for 100 years because everyone involved has a reason to look the other way. The families of Blackwater County did not vanish. They were taken, one, by men they knew, men who told them lies they wanted to believe. They were walked down a narrow trail to a pool beneath a limestone bluff, and the river carried the evidence away. Their land was bought for pennies on the dollar. Their descendants, the ones who had been sent away as small children in the first months of the scheme, before the killings began, grew up elsewhere under new names and never knew. Their houses stood empty until the plows finally broke them down. The fields grew over, the railroad came, the stations were built, and the towns along the line prospered. The children of the men who had done the killing attended good schools, served in legislatures, and were buried under marble monuments in cemeteries far from the pool beneath the bluff. And the 4 words Sheriff Reuben Vaughn, pinned to the inside cover of his ledger in the last week of his life, remain perhaps the truest 4 words anyone has ever written about that season in that county. They took them willing, because the deepest horror of Blackwater County was not the killing. The deepest horror was the trust that made the killing possible. It was the polite knock at the door after dark. It was the familiar face on the porch holding a lantern. It was the quiet voice saying, "Get the children dressed. It is not safe here anymore. Come with me, and I will take you somewhere you will be safe." It was the willingness of the human heart to believe that the worst thing cannot happen to it, because the person telling the lie is someone it has known all its life. And it is the knowledge carried home by every one of those 67 people in the last 10 minutes of their lives, as the trail narrowed and the limestone platform came into view, and the men in the shadows stepped forward with the stones already prepared, that they had been wrong. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything has been revealed? Or do you think there are still families out there, descended from the survivors, who carry fragments of the truth without knowing what they mean? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more forgotten American histories like this one, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload, and share this video with someone who believes, as I do, that the past is never truly past, and that the things we bury always eventually come back up. I will see you in the next video.